welcome to Life Without Baby. Today I'm talking to Tracey Cleantis. And Tracey, many of you may know formally as La Belle at Rouge in her days of being incognito, but she is now Tracey Cleantis, and she is also now the author of The Next Happy, Let Go of the Life You Planned and Find a New Way Forward. And I'm very excited to be talking to Tracey today, as I was fortunate enough to kind of walk along with her process of creating this book and having it out in the world. So hi, Tracey, welcome. Nice to talk to you.
Hi, Lisa. Thank you so much for having me.
You're very welcome.
It's really a perfect place to be because I feel like the birth of this book came sitting next to you on a stage at a conference.
That's right. Yeah, Tracey and I spoke at Fertility Planet conference a couple of years ago on the topic of letting go of the dream of motherhood. And we subsequently had a lunch afterwards and talked about it some more. And I remember Tracey saying, I'm thinking about writing this book. And I said, oh, yeah, that's a great idea. Good for you. And then it's 2 years almost to the day, I think, that this book is now out. And, this is a person who doesn't just talk about getting things done. So do you want to talk a little bit, Tracey, because you used to be La Belle at Rouge, and you wrote a lot about infertility and the psychology of infertility, kind of incognito, and then you've kind of came out of the infertility closet. So do you want to talk a little bit about your process, or your progression, if you like, from writing behind the scenes to coming out and talking about this really important topic of letting go of dreams?
Sure. I started blogging incognito because I'm a psychotherapist and I sort of thought that I shouldn't write about very personal material where everyone could see. Um, so I wasn't even intending to blog on infertility. I was going through infertility treatment at the time, but I'm also a Francophile, and I was writing about my love of things France. And but in the midst of the process, after another round where I didn't wasn't successful, um, I think the progesterone shots and the hormones and the pain just kind of took over, and I went to the blog and talked about the process of once again not being pregnant. And I had such a lovely response, and people were so kind and so supportive that I just um, felt compelled to continue to tell the truth about that process and write about it. But again, it was very vulnerable and very painful, and I didn't feel entirely comfortable having my name up there with so much pain. But over time, it just sort of organically evolved to where this is my truth, this is who I am, and so I changed it from La Belle at Rouge to Tracey.
Excellent, excellent. And can you tell us a little bit then about this process of expanding your own experience into this book now, which is really about letting go of those big dreams and being okay with that, finding peace with that. I mean, we talk about that so much, of letting go of our dreams, and of then that's step one, but then beyond that, you have to go and find a way to make peace with that decision.
Absolutely. When we were on that panel together, it was sitting there in front of an audience filled with people who were still actively trying to conceive. It was such a poignant and powerful moment. I'm sure you remember, seeing those people who are still trying and still want so much, so desperately to be having a child. I don't think you go to a fertility conference if you're ambivalent or at the end of that pursuit. So looking out at that audience and seeing people who were still so desperately trying, and also were looking to us for hope that they would be okay if it didn't work out. I was so touched by that, and also became aware that somehow that I had learned something about this process of letting go and moving on and getting to the next happy.
Mhm.
Um, in in my process of letting go, initially there was you weren't there, and other bloggers weren't there, and I went to the internet and I went to the bookstore looking for support and looking for a roadmap of how to get from the end of trying, the end of the dream, to not even happiness, just survival. How do I survive this? How do I live without this? And I wanted hope that that other people had done it. I wanted to not feel alone in that. And initially, there wasn't much support in that. And um, so, sitting there in front of that audience at Fertility Planet, I became aware of how much I had come to know about this journey. And I also became aware through the work in my private practice as a therapist how this is not just an experience for people who are trying to conceive and didn't do so, but it's a universal experience. Um, I kind of joke that by the time you're 21, you probably had to give up at least one dream. You probably didn't get into the college you want. You probably didn't date the guy you wanted to in high school. There's something as early as at the age of 21 that you've had to give up on some version of a dream, of a life you planned. Um, and, I think we both put a lot into trying to conceive and trying to have a baby. And it was a decade-long pursuit for me. But I don't think that it's about time. It's not about time. It's about an intensity of a vision of I really wanted this outcome. I really invested a lot emotionally, behaviorally, cognitively. I've invested a lot of resources in some dream, and how do I give up on that dream? I think the culture doesn't give us a lot of permission to give up on a dream. We're told everywhere on bumper stickers, in books, in TED talks that we should really never, never, never give up. And I
Right.
wanted to give people permission to give up.
So, I mean, I know that you talk a lot in the book about this danger of living in this never give up culture. We talk a bit. I'm sure everybody who's watching this has heard somebody say to them, don't give up hope. If you just believe, if you just keep trying. And I know you talk in the book about one of the things that kind of the sparks that triggered this book was watching a celebrity couple who had successfully eventually been through fertility treatments and were given that broadcasting that message of all you have to do is not give up. And for those of us who've walked that path, we know that's actually not sufficient. So what are some of the dangers of living in this kind of, environment where we're taught to never give up?
The costs of this message are so pernicious and so varied. I think that we're initially, in hearing that message, you sort of feel shame or guilt or like a failure if you're not able to stick to that message. If the reality is that you can no longer afford it financially to pursue whatever dream, if that's having a baby or being an actor or having a business or staying in a marriage, whatever the dream is, if there are costs that you can no longer afford, that are costs to your health, costs to your body, costs to your spirituality, costs to relationship, costs to your sense of self. I think people don't really understand how to continue to pursue something without getting any closer to that goal really changes your sense of self, your worldview, and has really long-reaching consequences.
So how do you know? How do you know when it's time to give up, and how do you know if you're giving up too soon, and how do you know that you're not going to regret that decision? Because I
It's
think that's the big stumbling block for a lot of people. If, well, what if I'm wrong? What if it really was the next time that it was going to work out? What if I just really did need to give my body some time or take a month off or whatever it is? I mean, how do you know?
Yeah, there's not an easy answer to that, and I wish there was an easy answer. I know for myself, I feel like I had some kind of gift of grace before I began my treatment. In that, I had a conversation with myself, and I was so nervous about starting IVF drugs, and so much anxiety of what that was going to do to my body, and what that experience was going to be like. And I went on a walk before I began treatment, and this wise voice, much wiser than myself, said to me, at some point, if this doesn't work, you'll stop. And I feel so grateful to have had that voice. And I know not everyone has that. I think that for some people, it's from the beginning, I'm just going to keep at this until it happens, no matter what. So I do wish for everyone that they would have had that experience. But if you didn't, I think that when you're pursuing any dream, to continue to check in with yourself, to continue to be aware of, how is this hurting my body? What are the costs? Are they too great? What are the costs to my relationship? What are the costs to my emotional health? What's the long-term financial costs of this goal? And to really consciously and mindfully ask those questions, and not just get on a kind of single-minded track of, I'm just going to endure any pain um, to achieve this goal. Um, that Lance Armstrong has a famous quote. I'm going to not get this exactly right, but essentially that pain lasts for a moment, but quitting lasts for a lifetime.
Mm.
And I think Lance Armstrong is such a perfect example of the danger of that kind of message. It's the pain can have long-lasting implications, and so to really take the time to engage with yourself and find out, what are the costs in this moment, and am I willing and able to continue on this pursuit.
And I think when you're on this journey and you are already so caught up in, input of information and doctor's appointments and testing and measuring and counting and logging, that there really isn't that time to just stop and just listen to what you're saying to yourself. And I know that on my journey, I realized that some of my biggest decisions came when I did stop, and I did, just like you say, went for a walk, not to sort it all out in my head, but to just walk and just have a moment of quiet in this kind of crazy journey that you're on, to just listen to what you're really telling yourself. And I know that definitely I experienced that as well as hearing that voice telling me, this is not really what you want to do. This is not right. But
And
it's hard to do.
it is, and I think with infertility treatment, that there's a kind of, when a round fails, and you have that conversation with the nurse at your reproductive endocrinologist office, there's just a kind of an assumption of, okay, well, this is what we're doing next. That
Right.
There's not a moment, there's not a space, because if you're going to do the next round, you've got to get ready to do that, so that there's not that moment to pause. And so, in taking that time to just kind of check in and say, why am I doing this? Can I do this? Do I have the resources to do this? I think it is such an important series of questions to ask yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. So you talk in the book about this idea of happiness, and kind of two things of, that sometimes actually accomplishing your dreams don't bring that happiness that you expected them to. Can you talk a little bit about that? I think that's a
Absolutely.
fascinating topic.
Yeah, I think, I know for me, in my pursuit of baby, there was so much fantasy about what that would be like. And the fantasy was likely not very close to the reality experience. Um, and I became aware in my grieving process, which was long and hard and difficult. And I also want to say, I feel like is important to get to the next happy is the grief. But we can get back to
Yeah,
that.
let's talk about that in a minute then, because I agree with you on that.
um, I became aware that there was a kind of fantasy. I talk in the book about analyzing your dream, your daydream, your dream for whatever the big dream is or the big goal is. That there's a kind of unconscious fantasy that we don't really often unpack. Um, and we don't really kind of ask ourselves, well, what do we think will happen if we get this thing, if we achieve this goal? Um, and there's a narrative to that that I think almost we don't really want to know because it fuels us to just to keep that unconscious. If we became aware of, well, if I get this, I will be happy, or I'll feel more loved, or I will have the kind of family I always dreamed of. If we become aware of that, probably there's enough cognitive uh, awareness that maybe not. Maybe it's not going to be exactly as we imagine. So really, to deconstruct the nature of the dream, I think, is so important and so liberating. And in my own grief work around not having a child, a very wise analyst asked me, uh, "Why did you want this so much?" And I remember feeling like it was the most absurd question. I didn't really even want to engage with it, and I just wanted to kind of push it away. And after I let it sink in, I became aware that there was a kind of hope of giving a child the kind of childhood I didn't have, and creating this ideal, perfect um, childhood for another.
Mm.
And a kind of light went off inside myself to say, maybe that wouldn't have gone as well as you'd hoped. Maybe your version of an ideal childhood wouldn't have been perfect for that child, and I would have, I think, maybe initially been taking care of my own. I don't love this phrase, but my own inner child through this other, and that maybe would have not been so good for that other, and hopefully I would have caught it quickly and stopped doing that. But in that awareness, I started to be able to have that creative a corrective emotional experience for myself and start tending to myself and mothering myself and giving myself that experience. And I also want to say, as important as that is, I did want the separate experience of having a child, separate from my own psychological motivation. But in knowing that, I was able to uh, address that in a way that the suggestions I got from others, I think you probably heard them. Well, if you want to be a mother, you can be an aunt, or you can be a godmother, or you can take care of other people's kids. Well, that still wouldn't have got to the core of what was motivating me. And in coming back and tending to myself and caring for myself and correcting some of those childhood wounds, um, I was able to give myself that.
And how, for somebody watching thinking, oh, this is resonating with me. I mean, how do you go about tapping into those questions yourself and really, addressing that yourself and finding ways to do what you did?
In the book, I have for each chapter, I have a series of questions that I might ask you if we were in therapy together that help you kind of come to a greater awareness of why you want this so much. What might be some of the fantasy? What might be some of the psychological motivation of why you want this so very much? And help you kind of deconstruct whether that's entirely possible, or or if you perhaps should withdraw some of that in terms of your pursuit of a baby or whatever the goal is.
Mm. Yeah. Can you talk then now a little bit about the grief process? And I tend to hammer home this a lot because this is one of the big revelations of my own journey was really the importance of allowing yourself to grieve that dream and the loss of that dream. So I would love it if you could talk a little bit about that.
I feel like it's just absolutely the most important gift you can give yourself is the time to grieve, and it's so difficult. I mean, the first thing that's so hard to do is to say I'm done trying. It's brutal. Um, but I think perhaps sometimes we stay in it because we don't want to feel the grief. We may be actually motivationally done. We may not have the energy or the resources, but we just can't take the grief experience. And the reasons for that are so varied and so complicated. From every where we turn in the culture says big boys don't cry and go to your room if you're not going to have a smile on your face. And we just get those messages over and over that people really aren't okay with our sadness, with our anger, with our rage, with all of these feelings that come up during the grief process. And I get calls from people asking me within 3 months of a major loss. They'll say to me, "Shouldn't I be done by now? Shouldn't I feel better in 3 weeks?" Um, so we really don't have a clear understanding of what the grief process is. And I talk in the book about there's books that guide you what to expect when you're expecting. And I probably had 2 copies of that book. But there are not a lot of books about what to expect when you're grieving. And I really, in this book, kind of take your hand, not just as a therapist, but as someone who's been through this grief process to say, your feelings are normal, and this is what you should expect. And it's important to give yourself space and time and to take care of yourself during this and to feel it fully. Which is really, it's so tough. I'm not, we're asking something big of people when we ask them to grieve, but the consequences of not grieving, I think, are ultimately you don't allow the next happy to come in if you haven't fully grieved it. Um, and in the book, I talk about the ugly stepsisters of emotion that we meet during the grief process that no one wants to meet. Envy, shame, guilt. These are part of the grief process, and it's really those are tough feelings to meet, to engage, and to make space for. But I think are ultimately so important in terms of healing in some way, uh, uh, and getting through the process to being open to your next happy.
And while we're on the topic of grief, for many people, they're dealing with a double set of grief where they have a spouse or partner who is either also grieving or expressing his or her grief in a different way, or just, in denial. So you're in that situation where you're trying to get yourself through this terrible state of grief, but also trying to pull somebody else along with you who either doesn't want to go or wants to go through it a different way. So, from your point of view of a therapist, how do you help someone through that?
I think it's such a common experience for, I would almost say universal experience that partners are going to go through the grief process in a different way. And that it has so much to do with history and their own grief history and what family allows. Excuse me. Some people are immediately going to be more in touch with their anger. Some people are immediately going to be more in touch with their sadness. And some people are going to just have a kind of numb, repressive kind of pushing down of feelings. And and as I mentioned before, there's already so many feelings of I'm grieving wrong, I'm grieving too long, I'm not grieving the right way, and to have a partner who may be grieving differently, it can exacerbate those feelings of I'm doing this the wrong way.
Mm-hmm.
And wanting in your partner a kind of perfect mirror, which doesn't just show up in the grief process, by the way. Wanting your partner to be exactly on the same page with you, and if they're not, to feel like they're wrong or you're wrong, and try to change your own grief or get them to grieve your way. It can create a lot of conflict in the relationship, and I think a lot of discord that can lead to more serious relationship problems. So I really like to, in my work with people, I really like to make clear that that your grief process is as unique as your fingerprint. There's not one standard grief experience, and that likely your partner, their experience is going to be very, very different than yours, but it doesn't mean that they're not grieving.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So one last completely loaded question. Did you ever envision that your next happy would look like it does?
Uh, Lisa, I didn't. I have to tell you, and I want everyone to know this, especially people who are going through infertility grief. I never, 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 never thought I could be happy without a child. I didn't think it was possible. And this kind of happiness that's emerged doesn't involve a big dream. It doesn't involve something that I'm chasing that is requiring me to put my life on hold, on my life on layaway to pursue it. It just emerged out of letting myself grieve and slowly starting to follow a kind of interest of, oh, well, maybe I'll do this, or I'll think about this, or what about this, and it just snuck up on me. But I can tell you for sure that it wouldn't have happened if I didn't grieve, if I had quickly filled in that grief, that pain, with something else, with a quick fix, with an easy suggestion, with the obvious choice. Um, Letting myself fully have that process, this kind of happiness that I have, never thought it would happen.
Yeah, yeah. Good for you. So, if anybody would like to experience their own version of their next happy, where can they get the book?
They can certainly. I'd love them to visit my webpage, TraceyCleantis.com.
And I'll put all this in the. I'll put it in the post so that people can
and
find
it's
that.
Available bookstores everywhere, and
Great.
Available in paperback and Kindle. So I would love it if you would come by and visit my website and say hi.
Wonderful. Tracey, as always, it's been such a pleasure speaking to you. I always enjoy our conversations, and an honor for me to be able to actually record this and be able to share this. So thank you so much for taking time today to share your story with us and your insight. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Lisa. Absolutely my pleasure.
Take care.
Awesome.